One of the greatest poets who ever lived once sat down and wrote a funeral poem for his best friend. Every line of it aches. There's only one problem. His friend wasn't dead. Now imagine you cross the sea as a teenager to the largest empire on earth, and you turn out to be so brilliant they simply won't let you leave. You spend 35 years climbing a foreign court. You become a brother to the most famous poet alive. And the day the tide finally turns for you, it swallows your ship whole. Or so the whole world believes. The truth was stranger and lonelier than a death. Let me tell you the story of a man caught forever between two lands and the one thing that hung over both of them, the moon. It's the early 700s, and Japan is a young country in a hurry. Off to the west, across a stretch of very dangerous water, sits the greatest civilization on earth, Tang Dynasty China. And Japan has made a decision. Everything worth having, we're going to go and get it from them. Their laws, their writing, their poetry, their whole way of running a state. So, every few years, Japan gathers up its best and brightest, loads them onto wooden ships, and sends them out across that killing sea on a mission they called the Kentoshi, the embassy to the Tang. In the year 717, one of the young men chosen is a noble boy, around 19 years old, sharp, gifted, the kind of student who makes his teachers a little nervous. His name is Abe no Nakamaro, and the night before he sails, I want you to picture him standing in the old capital of Nara looking up. There's a hill on the edge of the city, Mount Mikasa, and the moon comes up over it the way it has every night of his life. He doesn't know it yet, but that is the last time he will ever see that moon from home. Hold on to that. It comes back. Now, the crossing nearly kills them. These voyages drown people all the time, but Nakamaro's ship makes it through, and he walks into Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Dynasty. Now, I need you to understand what that city was. At that moment, Chang'an was almost certainly the largest city on the planet. 1 million people! Walls you could see from a day's ride out. Markets where you'd hear a dozen languages in a single street. Persian traders, camels coming in off the Silk Road, monks from India, wine from the far west. It was the center of the world. And here's this kid from a small wooden capital standing right in the middle of it. And then Nakamaro does something that almost nobody from the outside ever managed. He enters the Imperial Academy. He masters the Chinese classics, a foreigner, in a second language. And he takes on the examinations the Tang used to sort their scholars, a system so brutal it broke Chinese men who had studied for it their entire lives. And he beats it. He walks in and wins himself a place in the emperor's own court. Just imagine being one of those Chinese scholars who'd been grinding away since childhood, watching the exchange student stroll in and ace it. He even takes a Chinese name, Chao Heng, and he starts to climb. Real posts, real responsibility. He ends up serving in the court of the emperor himself, Xuanzong, and that is exactly where the trap springs shut, because Nakamaro is too good. He's too useful. So when he finally asks, the way anyone would, to go home to see Japan again, the answer is no. The emperor does not want to lose him, so he stays a year, then a few years, then, and I really want you to feel this, decades. The boy who came for a visit is turning into a middle-aged man in a foreign court, and the sea he crossed once has quietly become a door that only opens one way. Now, if you have to be trapped somewhere, there are far worse places than Tang Dynasty's Chang'an at the height of its golden age, because this was the single greatest era of poetry in Chinese history, maybe in anyone's history. Nakamaro wasn't standing outside of it with his face pressed to the glass. He was in it. He became friends, real friends, with the poets whose name Chinese school children still memorize 13 centuries later. Wang Wei and Lǐ Bái, who plenty of people will tell you flat out is the greatest poet China ever produced. That was Nakamaro's friend. Think about that. A man from Japan had become part of the beating heart of Chinese literature itself. The poems, the words, moving back and forth between these two peoples. Nakamaro was living right inside that exchange. But underneath all the honors and the friendships, there was one thing he never stopped wanting. 30 years is a long time to carry a small quiet wish, to see that hill one more time. And then, finally, the door opens a crack. Around the year 752, a new Japanese embassy arrives in Chang'an, and Nakamaro, who is now in his mid-50s, an old man by the measure of his day, is at last given permission to go home with them after 35 years. 35 years, and he's going home. His friends throw him a send-off party, and at that gathering, 2 poems get written that will outlive every single person in that room. Wang Wei writes Nakamaro a goodbye, a poem about a friend sailing off the edge of the known world and the ache of not knowing if you will ever hear from him again. And Nakamaro writes one too. He looks up at the autumn moon hanging over this foreign city that has been his entire adult life, and he writes this: "When I gaze up, out across the plain of heaven, is that not the very same moon that rises over Mount Mikasa back home?" That's the whole poem. The moon he's staring at in China is the exact same moon that came up over that hill the night before he left, all those years before. One moon holding 2 homelands together across an impossible distance. And here's a thing that really gets me. Japanese children still learn that poem today. 1,300 years later, it's one of the most loved poems in the language, and he wrote it homesick at a party in another country. And then he boards the ship, an old man finally going home. The fleet sets out across the open sea, and out there in the dark, a storm comes down on them. One carrying the man who waited 35 years for this exact voyage is thrown off course, out of sight, and gone. Word makes its way back to Chang'an. The ships are lost. Nakamaro is drowned. And Lǐ Bái, the greatest poet in China, who has just lost one of his closest friends in the world, sits down and pours all of that grief into an elegy. And the image he reaches for is the one Nakamaro himself had used. He writes that the bright moon has not come home, that it sank down into the deep blue sea and did not return. His friend was the moon, and the moon had drowned. And I need you to sit with this for a second. The most famous poet in the history of China just wrote a funeral poem for a man who is not dead. If a twist like that isn't worth hitting subscribe for, I honestly don't know what is, because where Nakamura actually was at that exact moment is the strangest part of this whole story. Stay with me, because he was not at the bottom of the sea. His wrecked ship had been driven hundreds of miles the wrong way, all the way south, down to a place the Chinese called Annan, the far edge of the empire in what is now Vietnam. And it was a nightmare down there. A lot of the people who had set out with him were killed along the way. But Nakamaro lived, and half broken, he turned around and started back, overland this time, clawing his way north up the whole length of the entire empire to get back to Chang'an. It took him about 2 years. And when he finally staggered back into the capital, the whole world he'd left was gone. While he was away, the Tang had torn itself wide open in a massive rebellion, the kind of war that ends golden ages. The country was on fire, and whatever thin sliver of a chance he'd have of ever boarding another ship to Japan, that closed too, for good. He never sailed again. He never saw home. Instead, he gave the rest of his life to the empire that had kept him. He served it. They even sent him back to govern that far southern frontier, Annan. the very edge of the world that had almost killed him. And in the year 770, an old man in his 70s, Abe no Nakamaro, died in Chang'an in China, having never once set foot in Japan again. So here's the question this whole life leaves sitting in your chest. Where was home? The country he was born in? The one that let him go and slowly, quietly half forgot him? Or the one that was never supposed to be his at all? The one that raised him into a man, handed him its highest honors, and grieved him so hard that its greatest poet wept over a moon drowned in the sea. He looked up at it his whole life. The same moon, over Nara, over the southern jungles that nearly took him. He never did make it back to the hill it once rose over. But maybe, in the end, he didn't have to, because a country he wasn't even born in loved him enough to weep when they thought that moon was gone. Now, if a man giving his whole life to a land that was never his got under your skin, I've got another one for you. A monk who made that same crossing from the other direction, walking into China, sat down facing a blank stone wall, and didn't move for 9 years. What he was waiting for ended up reshaping 2 nations. It's the video on your screen right now. Click it to watch, and I'll see you in the next story.